This is Liz Thach. She is a textile and three-dimensional artist working in many different mediums, who Nancy Gustin introduced to us and brought on board here, and we're so excited. So I'm just going to let you have it, and
thank you for
we'll see
doing
what
this.
happens.
I think we were talking about this, and we were still, kind of getting, it was like 20. No, was it 2021 or was it 2020? Anyway,
It might have been 2020.
we were kind of, trying to figure out what's it gonna look like. So thank you everybody for working with me to make this happen in this kind of these strange times. So when we were talking about what this workshop would be, so I was kind of taken aback because I was trying to think of like, a demonstration, and in terms of what I would actually be demonstrating, because I am self-taught in terms of crochet, and so actually showing people what I do, it's very organic and it's very intuitive, and so I'm like, I don't even know what I do, so how would I show anyone else what I do? So I was, in terms of what I thought would be the most interesting, is to talk about how I kind of move towards actually doing what I do in crochet, using crochet. So I'm trained as a painter, and so my approach to it is very much as a painter approaching materials and trying to make an image. And so there's a lot of, I was kind of learning how to use yarn and the hook for a long time before they actually before it all came together, and I was like, I can do what I do in the studio with this. And so there's kind of like it was really a wonderful thing when it started to kind of come together. But in terms of painting ideas, so I am assuming that everyone here is an artist or is a craftsperson, or kind of has some familiarity with the, kind of the process of making stuff. Painting, so I'm trained as a painter, and painting has a lot of baggage, so there's a lot of kind of fine art stuff associated with painting, and so there's a lot of art historical terminology, and a lot of, this is very important because this is this precious object. So that's in my brain, and I spent a lot of time looking at art, and I spent a lot of time in kind of very fancy, rarefied art spaces, and so that's kind of the lens that I think about things, and I think about things in relation to what's outside of this kind of museum space. So getting right into kind of the painting ideas that I'm looking at. There was a wonderful show at the MFA, the Boston MFA, a couple of years ago, and it was kind of a quirky show because it was Matisse and the items that he collected. So he kind of was approaching him as a still life artist with these other, this is the vase that he collected, and these are the textiles that he collected. And so you can see, so this is a painting, and he's got this curtain, and this is an Egyptian curtain from his collection, and they actually had the pieces of his, that he was painting, and then these are the stuff that he collects, which is awesome because the things that he's collecting are really wonderful. And so I find a lot of stuff. I read didactics, and so the little stuff next to the piece. Sometimes I kind of go down the rabbit hole in terms of the stuff that they're, that you find in there, because there's good stuff. So this Egyptian curtain that Matisse owned, so this is Arabic on top of it, and so it's from a panel of 3. So he had one, but the Arabic on the top says, "The humble man shall be exalted, the greedy man shall be forgotten." And so there was something about this was happening at the same time as, do you remember Homeland? That Homeland, the documentary. So there was a big kerfuffle because Homeland had hired artists to make graffiti for a set that they were making. So they were like, you do Arabic graffiti. This is going to be great. We're going to pay for you to make authentic Arabic graffiti. And so they made authentic Arabic graffiti, but what the Arabic graffiti said was, Homeland is racist. And no one, because it looks authentic. so it got into the show, and everyone who could understand Arabic knew that Homeland was racist, and so I loved it because it was these artists, people couldn't see what was in front of their faces because there was something that was lost in translation, and so this, that's kind of what this is. Like, I can't read that, but that's so beautiful, and it's like right in front of my face, and so that's something that I think about, and I think about language, and anyway, so that was something that I'm thinking about. And then another thing that I'm drawn to is kind of artists who are in these spaces but are kind of thinking about art as visions, or kind of not thinking about it in terms of like composing a painting or as a problem to be solved, but are thinking about, are just operating on a different set of urgency. And so Forrest Bess was a artist who was working in Betty, the famous gallerist. It was Betty, I have my notes. It was Betty Parsons, was it?
Cunningham?
Yeah. Was it, who was Forrest Bess's gallerist?
Is it Betty Cunningham?
It might be Betty Cunningham. It was the famous gallerist in New York. Okay. So he was, his gallerist, who was also dealing with all of the kind of abstract expressionists, started dealing with him, but he was a very much kind of a visionary, a very, very strange and interesting artist. But these images have kind of an urgency to me, and I am continually compelled by them every time I see them, because they're so mysterious, but they feel so right. And then another artist who is operating under, in different contexts. This is Hilma af Klint. I don't know if anyone saw, there's a really big retrospective of her work. So she is, kind of working with spiritualism in the turn of the century, and she was basically unknown. But she was, she was telling everyone in 1900, I'm going to be famous. People aren't ready for my work yet, but I'm making notes, and this is what they all mean. And when you have the retrospective, I'll be dead, but this is the way it's gonna look. And it's gonna be a circle going up to enlightenment, and it looks just like the Guggenheim, where her show was. And she's like, you're just not ready for me yet. But she has little notes where she's annotating. And by the way, all of the art historians are gonna need these notebooks. It's insane. And so they're so amazing. So, and also, the history of modernism kind of doesn't even deal with these, and so this is this whole chapter of modernist, of a female who just was not even, it was invisible, and suddenly it's visible. So anyway, I look at that a lot. And then these are terrible reproductions as I'm looking at them. They looked better small, but Joseph Albers, I think about color, and so he was dealing with the Bauhaus and had a lot of ideas about the read of a different, so this is the same color, but it looks different next to the green, and it pops next to the blue, whereas it looks more like a darker color when it's next to a lighter yellow. So just kind of basic color principle theory that I use a lot in practice, of putting different colors next to each other. And also his wife, Annie Albers, both of them were working in the Bauhaus, but in the Bauhaus is a arts and crafts movement in the 30s in Germany, and women who wanted to study art were sent to the weaving rooms. And so, there's some definite understandings of what women artists could be making and should be making, which, we can kind of contend with those now, but the things that they made were amazing. And so there's a part of the history that, women's work that can kind of be revisited. Anyway, so I think about these a lot.
Both of those are woven?
These are woven. This is actually a seriograph. So yeah. So this is actually a seriograph. So this is an actual weaving.
Yeah.
And then this is a seriograph that was made in like 69. So the Bauhaus were seen as being, depraved artists. And so they fled Germany from when Hitler's vision of art was a very, very much not in line with avant-garde. So Hitler wanted it to be very representational and columns and very Greek, classical, traditional, which I think is why there's a lot of prejudice against representation as a result of kind of these political things that went down in 1930s and taste. But anyway, so they came to a lot of American art in the 1950s is from people fleeing. Everyone here may know all this, so sorry if I'm getting, but anyway, so they came from the Bauhaus and they founded the Black Mountain School. And so she made this in 1969 when they were in the Black Mountain School. So, which was in kind of a really important place for America really lucked out in terms of our artistic, all these lots of talent coming from other places. And then, so in the 1950s, so then that's kind of when a lot of, what we think of as like high art started kind of getting solidified. And so this is Philip Gustin, who was, these are made in the 1950s with this enormous amount of energy and passion about, kind of abstract imagery. So the idea was that painting was not going to be representational, because representational was a thing of the past, and that painting needed to be more vital. It needed to be not cliched, it needed to do something. And so it was like a religion. So painting, there was painting that were paintings of things, and then there was painting that was pure, and pure painting was the way to go. And so what Gustin is really an interesting painter, because these are paintings that he made. He kind of had almost like a breakdown, and for a year he didn't show anything, he just made these ink drawings. And what happened is that he started making paintings of things, these kind of comic cartoon paintings of things. Friends as a result of making this work, because it was seen as being kind of comic, cartoonish. It was seen as being so puerile. And, we can't even think about that now, because the time that we're living in, we've seen it's just what you can do as an artist is so much broader. But at that point in time, it was a very delineated in terms of where painting was supposed to be going, and you were either on the train or you were off the train. And what another artist who was looking at these paintings kind of said about it is that it was about freedom. And so Philip Gustin basically said, I need to make paintings that I need to make, and there's an urgency in these paintings that make them kind of very timely. And he also deals with a lot of really kind of issues that feel increasingly urgent now. He was making paintings about the Ku Klux Klan and kind of dealing about, he had started his career as a not a revolutionary, but he had started his career with a lot of very socially minded artists in California. So all of these things start coming back into these images, and increasingly his work is seen as being kind of really relevant in the now that we're living in. So I think about him a lot. And then I think about, so in terms of the way that I think about craft, this is where we start to, a lot of my painting ideas, there's a typo that I just called everyone's attention to. G's Pen Quilters are a group of quilters who worked in Alabama. It's 3 generations of quilters who are working together and who are making the most amazing quilts. And everything that I think about that I would like for a painting to be, these quilts do. And just the urgency, and just, here it is. And I'd always been drawn to this, but I'd been coming at it from, well, I'm a painter, this isn't my tradition, I'm a painter, but I wish I could make something that wasn't, that was more than a painting. So these are kind of a touchstone, is like something that's made in a community that's coming kind of at a different, that's making something, but it's coming at it from a different kind of place. And then this is an artist that I actually have kind of come across through Instagram, the wonderful world of Instagram. And now I'm like, oh, why didn't I know about her before? Oh, I knew about her from Instagram, but I've also saw her in 3 different craft shows, like the past year, 3 years. But Ellen Lesperance is a knitter. So she's kind of making knitting sweaters, but she started looking at, there was a movement, a women's movement in England in the 80s, where there were nuclear warheads that were in a base outside of England that the United States Army had kind of parked in a base. And so these women were protesting it, like, it's too close to England, we don't want it, it was a time where, nuclear warfare, this could be, it was a key point in these whole negotiations in 1980. And so these women kind of marched to they called it the peace camp, the Greenham Peace Camp. And the women marched and kind of just set up camp, trying to get them to move these missiles. And while the women were hanging out there, they started knitting. And so the sweaters that they were making, so they were just kind of hanging out waiting. It's a protest that is just kind of going on for days. And so they're sitting around campfires, singing songs and knitting. And they're sweaters that she went back and looked at photos of. And they're like 1980s bright peace signs, sweaters, all about, kind of these revolutionary fervor. And so these are drawings that she makes from the photos. These are little, patches on someone's pants. So this is like an outfit that someone's wearing. So this is her pattern, and then she makes the sweaters. But just kind of thinking about that idea as like a protest idea, or just that women are coming together and doing something and making something to kind of make something positive. It's kind of interesting. And the work is beautiful. So, and then Peter Halley is an artist. Everything kind of as old as new, and he's an artist who was thinking about circuits. So he's kind of coming at it from high modernism, color and painting, and but he was thinking about kind of mapping social ideas about how people work together and ideas of power and all of these things. But I remember I saw him talk when I was like a young art student. I remember thinking, they're just paintings. He's talking about all these ideas of diagrams, but the painting still is very emphatic, and the colors are very emphatic. And kind of how he was talking about, which was more important. Was it a diagram about an idea, or was it the painting, or was it both? And kind of those ideas are something that I've always kind of been wrestling with, increasingly. But I think about that imagery, like I think it kind of got into my head in terms of these circuits and things that are connected. And just one more painter. This is Stanley Whitney. I don't know, has anyone seen these paintings? These paintings, this is a drawing, or a print, but these paintings are big, and they're just showstoppers. And they're just these amazing, improbably simple, but so complex. And these kind of get into my head and are things I think about. And this was, so now I'm going to start talking about my work and kind of how there are pieces here. We can actually start looking at the work, but there are pieces that before I started trying to kind of paint, I was doing kind of little problems. I was like, oh, what can I do? What is something that I can do with a yarn that might be a challenge. It was almost like little tricks. And this was kind of an Albers, the blacks in this, so it reads as, I was trying to make it so that these blacks read as like a straight color across, but it's a different color. So this is a blue, this is a blue, this is a green, this is a different blue, this is so they're all of these colors, that's a green. So all of these colors on each band are different. And so I was trying to come up with like different color combinations that would read as a dark, that would be a consistent thing all the way through. And so that was the challenge, that was the rules. And then I was able to just kind of see what happened as I did that. And so that was something that was kind of absorbing and really interesting for me. I apologize for these slides as well. And then another, this is kind of, so I did that, and then I'm like, oh, how could I use stripes to draw with just the negative space? And so I was thinking about pixels, and I was thinking about using, so I knew how to make a full block of color, but I was thinking about trying to create a block of color, but not using using stripes, but still creating a block of color by using the negative space. And it made my brain hurt. It's kind of something like you think about when you make printmaking, and you have to think about making a reverse.
Mm-hmm.
And which I made this in 2020, and everything was locked down, and I was kind of like, it wasn't going to work, and we didn't know if we were gonna, who knows if we're gonna have jobs, who knows if the end world is gonna be over. And so this was really, really great to think about. And it, just kind of like this game, and like, oh, okay, all right. And so along the same lines, just kind of doing these patterns, and kind of thinking about, about making a pillow that could be cuddled or something. How decorative, could I do a pattern, or could I, how far could I carry a pattern before I had to like do something else? And then I've also, so these are, I've been making drawings on paper. So these are drawings on paper that all of this work, like all of my imagery has come from. So I've been making these drawings since like 2016. And so they're really kind of quick drawings on paper. They're all kind of the same size. They're all 11 by 15. And the imagery that kind of, I was, vessels and fragments and language. I started making crochet that was based on those drawings. And so then, I'm like, oh, I know, the things that I think about in my drawings of vessels started kind of showing up in these, but then I was also playing the games with the colors, right? So, this is a different color, and this is a different color, and trying to kind of play with how you can make a cohesive image using the darks, and how the darks can kind of hold the whole thing together, and how much you can get away with. And that is, trying to get away with stuff is a huge part of my practice. Is like how crazy can you push it until you still have an image. Like, it's important to me that you still have a point where it settles and there's something emphatic to read. And so this is like totally 2020 imagery. This is thinking about the Red Cross. And so, these kind of like the Red Cross boats outside of New York. But, and kind of lights, and kind of thinking about, New York when it was so grim for New York. But kind of like these little icons. and then these are more of the drawings that, and showing you the drawings, like it's kind of very clear to me, like there's a connection that these are kind of feeding all of this work. But also like labyrinths and mazes, I think about that, and kind of meditative, kind of how following a line in a carpet is kind of this point where you can just kind of concentrate on it. And also kind of repeated patterns, and thinking about kind of automatic, the way that automatic lines kind of seem like language, but they're not really like language, but maybe they're like stitch markers, or maybe they're like, markers of time. And masks and fragments. And also like when I was making these drawings, I was also kind of thinking about the edge. And so I was also trying to kind of make the paper piece not be a piece of paper. Like I wanted it to be a thing inside that thing, which kind of plays nicely in terms of like what these are, in the sense that they're not, they're things, like they're not trying to make it. And then there's a lot of language and hieroglyphs. This is my daughter looking at a hieroglyphic stone, and this is her children's literature. So she reads children's literature to me, and this is from novels about the Kane twins that are written by the guy who wrote Percy and the Lightning Thief. So Rick Riordan. So she's been reading me all of this kind of sci-fi for kids, and it is so good for art making. So it's explosions, and there's two-headed gods, and it's good stuff. But also thinking about language, and a lot of she was trying to teach me how to write hieroglyphs, and so that kind of has been very helpful. But thinking about magic and kids games, and kind of images, and like these other things that you can't necessarily understand, and kind of seeking. And also another thing that in terms of this, that this painting has that the crochet has kind of lended itself to, is like layering. So I always liked how you can see, these kind of layers of color upon that. And so trying to figure out how you do that with the crochet has been kind of a challenge. And how do you make, so that's white, but how do you make a less bright white? And so can you do it by making stripes of gray? Can you do it by does it have to be a different shade of white? Is it a cool white? Is it a warm white? So all of these kinds of ways that you can kind of do that is something that I'm still kind of thinking about. And then, just the language and the pattern. These are still drawings. And here, I think this might be the last one. So this is just, kind of a long one, thinking about a little scrap of writing, or like a scroll or something. And I think that's the last one. And so I brought in some pieces that we can actually look at. And then this is a large one that, as you can see, is kind of enormous and is kind of proceeding at they get a little unwieldy when they get this big. So this one I'll be probably working on for a long time. But these are kind of smaller ones that I've been working on. And so please, everybody, what can we go over?
Media at your own comfort level, but you're welcome to go over and
or
interact.
I don't know if everyone's had a chance to kind of.
Yeah.
Did you have a?
Are we gonna have any questions? Because I have a question for you.
So the way we were kind of thinking about this, and I don't really do formal. That was pretty formal. I was pretty formal. Yeah. I was thinking that I could do my formal thing, and then, but please ask questions, because I was thinking that we could kind of yes, ask questions.
I was just curious if you did your own dyeing of your yarn.
So this is,
especially when you were trying to make the, it read as the same color with the, you know what I mean?
oh yeah, totally. And so there was, that's the next grade. I mean, that's where it all gets going, right? So I'm coming up against my limitations in terms of color and like budget, because there's colors that I need. And so, I've had a good run, I keep, they started some new colors. So I have a very cheap yarn line. And now I'm kind of like, I really need to push the color. So the acid dyeing, so actually I have some dyeable fabric, or some dyeable yarn. And so that's the, I haven't done it yet. I have had to paint yarn, because I've run into situations where it just calls for more. And so I've done that, where I've actually put paint on the piece. And I've done things where I've actually sewn a different thread on the piece. And then, but I haven't done it. I ran out of a color, and I had to dye tea. I used tea to dye some yarn, because they were out. I needed it. And so,
what yarn is the yarn you've brought with you?
So this is there's a company called Knit Picks that is kind of a very, it's a mail order company, and so it's pure wool, and it's not that expensive. It felts, like you can't wash it, and so it felts, and it's really scratchy, but I like it. Because I like that felting, and I like that kind of, like they get kind of beat up, and I really appreciate that about it. And so using a better quality yarn is something that I'm like, what if I did that? And then also colors. But I think that, like painting, like mixing your own colors is a whole thing. And so I think that's a rabbit hole that I would need to kind of go into. I mean, that could be its whole thing. I mean, I can imagine spending a lot of time just dyeing yarn and not actually making anything. Because the color, just making the color. So, but I thought about it yet.
So I'm so curious, you've shown some of the drawings and paintings that have informed the crochet pieces. Do you find out that the crocheting has informed or changed your painting and drawing?
Yeah, definitely. So the incremental way that, so the speed of crochet, and this, you're just kind of, you can't see what evolves until you kind of move through the process. And so, and also, kind of the way that each stitch, like you create the image as a result of these little marks, is something that that's kind of started creeping into, definitely into more recent paintings on paper that I've been making, because I've kind of almost been thinking about little dollops of paint, because I'm trying to kind of use color the way that I use it here, and so it's definitely more organic, and they're definitely more tied, like the imagery and the images, kind of the way that the image kind of gets distorted just as the way of making the process is something that I think about in the drawings, and trying to kind of so in when I paint, I have to fake it, and so I'm always interested in kind of how you create a new process so that you don't have to fake it, so that it emerges as a result of making it. And so that I almost have to relearn how to paint now. So I'm like, oh, do I need to do prints? Do I need stamps? There's something that I haven't figured out about how to bring this to that, but it's something that I'm thinking about. And that, I mean, I think that as an artist, my practice, I don't have discrete practices. It all kind of comes together. And so, like when I'm in the studio, I've got these on the wall, I've got drawings on the wall, I've got, sculptures, and I'm all kind of thinking of it, of them as an environment. We were talking earlier before the formal stuff started. We were talking about kind of ideas about decorating and ideas about interiors and ideas about domesticity. And so I'm really interested in, like, I'm looking at, art spaces, but I am really drawn to kind of these strange, like the Isabel Stewart Gardner, like these spaces that are house spaces with art, with curtains and fabrics and textiles and these kind of complex environments that people lived in. I mean, not everybody is living in the style to which Isabel Stewart Gardner is accustomed, but in terms of these, interiors, like people, the way that people live and these just pattern on top of pattern on top of pattern is really interesting to me. So I'm thinking about that and how you kind of, how that can inform your context and all that stuff. Yes?
A question about how you work on a bigger piece. How much ahead of time are you thinking as you're working the piece, and how much is riffing on stuff that's going, all suddenly happens in front of you? And also, do you work back and forth, or do you work this way in sections?
So I am working, so I started this little piece in the middle, and then I'm working on directions. So I'm working this way, and then I'm working this way, and then I'm working that way. And I think I might have figured out the plan at about here. And so this one actually, so when they get this big, I kind of have to have a motivating, like, oh yeah, this is what this is. And so this is kind of like an urban plan. I mean, that's how I think about it. It's like an urban plan for a divine city. But yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the, like how a piece of crochet is formed? Because, for someone like who knits or who weaves, or it all happens in a really linear motion, like you kind of go from top to bottom, whereas I know crochets can be much more organic. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about like the technique and the way that a structure forms in crochet.
Yes. So I can even show you. So, I mean, and again, it'll all be wrong.
No, please.
And also it'll all be totally, because I'm left-handed, so it's all
reversed.
Okay, so, and I can just start. So it gets kind of, so the way that I was actually talking to someone about knitting. So knitting, if you stop in the middle, the whole thing comes apart. And so what's nice about crochet is that I can stop. I mean, I can stick the needle in, like, and this is not sharp. So, I mean, probably no one's gonna sit on it in my house. So, I'm just kind of, I'm just gonna do it with this. Yeah, so it's basically a knot, right? So it's just and I'm, I tend to tuck stuff in so that so it's a knot, so that, I can just stop it, and it'll kind of hang in there. And if I'm worried about it, I'll tie it off. But that's basically how I'm making them all. So it's really simple.
And you can start on any part of the cloth, is that right?
You can start anywhere.
Yeah.
I am working mostly in rows.
Yeah.
You have to, there's a little bit of space in between each row, and I learned the hard way because I don't know why I didn't even read the instructions. You have to give yourself an extra stitch, otherwise it goes like that.
Right.
And so, so you have to kind of increase, and so, at the end, you have to kind of give yourself extra
Yeah.
space. But because I'm not counting, and because a lot of times what I noticed is that when I do color work, I pull it tight so that because I like it to be a tighter shape.
Mm-hmm.
You lose some stitches from that, and so sometimes I have to give myself some extra stitches, otherwise the whole thing, like, it starts to get really good, but then your piece gets smaller in the middle piece.
Yeah.
So, and I kind of I fake that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just, I guess I need more stitches. But, and yeah, and so some, you can see one of these, so I started this one I actually, sometimes it works out. So this one actually got started from the bottom, and I worked it like that, and so you can see the bottom, you can tell the bottom, where the bottom is, because there's kind of a different stitch. But I change it, and sometimes like, that's not working, and I'll have to go in and make stitches from that.
I like how you have the back reinforced.
Yeah, so the back reinforced was something that, when that's something that's evolved out of actual showing, because it is very, it's very,
Hard to show something that's stretchy, saggy.
saggy, and not, not square, and so that's made it easier, so then I can just give these to someone who can install them. And I've also, got pins that I've used that are painted so that they're not as, like, obvious.
Yeah.
Those are not the pins I use.
So you don't put hooks on the back, it's just pinned?
Again, it's still a work in progress, and right now I'm doing pins.
Yeah.
Because, I said, well, it would be easier if I had hooks on the piece, so I didn't actually have to install them.
Yeah.
And someone from my clerk group said, the artist should always install their work. I was like, ugh, that is just too much. But you can take that. They're pretty indestructible.
Liz, maybe you can show us even in like just maybe small chains or something, not ambitious with because crochet. Maybe just some of the color blending or how you pick like a dark versus a light or a saturated color versus and how you kind of like make those decisions with the material.
Sure. So there's a lot of just like bags of yarn. So a lot. It's kind of extravagant in terms of the way that I work, because usually when you do a project, like for something this needs a lot of yarn, and when you're doing a lot of different colors, that's a lot of yarn. And so the people who live at my house are wailing about the yarn apocalypse. And I'm able to work at home, but I mean, it's not pretty. That said, I require a lot of different colors, and so I work very intuitively, and so I think about it a lot of times with so these really, really bright colors, these kind of garish colors, are something that I kind of discovered fairly recently. I've always loved color. Like I've always wanted to be more, but something so unnatural like that, I never really saw myself kind of gravitating towards. But when you kind of tone it down, it just really, there's something just so ethereal about it that I really like. I like how unnatural it looks. And so increasingly, darks have always been kind of a, the dark values of how the darks can kind of hold a composition together. That's always been a really important part of my work. And so I've always loved color, but understanding that value is something that I need in terms of organizing the space has kind of opened up a lot of possibilities for me, because I was always like, oh, I just need bright color, and those darks, and understanding those darks and appreciating those darks has been really, really good. And so, like, in terms of darks, like, so that this is the dark that was reading as a black when you put it with something like that. And when you actually, and so that, I love that this can read as a black next to that, and that this can read as the same shape next to that when you're working. Yeah, everyone can come up if you want. And then the other thing that I think about, I have some more colors. I'm gonna come onto the, along the lines of darks. I'm also kind of thinking about, like, neutrals. Okay, so here's another dark color. Purple is purple and maroon are kind of like my Achilles heel, like in terms of thinking about how you use purple in a composition. That's something that I don't really use a lot of purple, but I'm like, whoa, there's so much there. So I'm really intrigued with that. It's kind of like the last
frontier.
Last frontier. There's a painter, Lisa Yesgavish. I don't know if anyone knows. She does kind of figurative work, but she does wild things with hues, where she'll do a whole painting that is like viridian green, and whoa, I didn't even know you could do that, and it's figurative work, but kind of creating these kind of high problems for herself. Like, I'm enough of a kind of a painting nerd to be like, whoa. So that really kind of jazzes me. And so, like, all the time, like, there are little kind of color problems that I'm setting for myself. So yeah, so in terms of like how I start, like the way that I start and what I end up with, here's kind of something that is monstrous that I'm kind of like working on right now. That is more of like a sampler.
Is it okay to pass it around?
Yeah, totally. That's around.
That way we can get it going. Oh, I'm sorry. I can get up.
I almost threw it, but that was not as professional as
It
it could
looks
have
like you
been.
don't use a whole lot of true white and true black.
Yeah.
That's very sparingly.
Yeah, no, that is really, and that is something that I have learned the hard way, is that black, so I have, so so if you, and this is like, so that's a coal, but even that isn't a true
Right,
white.
and that's not a true white either.
And that's not a true white.
Right.
And then, so here, so I'm working with all of these whites.
Mm-hmm.
And so white and black, I think there's ways that you kill something before it even starts. So in painters, painters are always like, oh, you have to mix your blacks. And you don't actually have to, but if you're thinking about color in a kind of a literal way, you're not even going to get off the ground. Yeah. And what I have found is that there's more life in something if the darks are moving. And so like this, I change, my darks, I change it up. Or even if I use black, I'll put black and blue and green just to kind of give it something, because I like the fluctuation. There's times when I want it to be flat, but I'm still, yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I don't want to interrupt you. With these with the lines going through, are you actually threading the different color through there?
It's a good question, and I have done that, but the way that I'm doing that is, and I can show you what it looks like.
Yeah,
So,
great.
Because it creates a really different
Mhm.
texture to the
so what happens, that
already
happens
texture.
when I pull over
Oh, wow.
a yarn like that. And so then that yarn is gonna be inside the
The
stitch.
stitch.
And I
Okay.
just pull that stitch.
And so you would deliberately, when you introduce a new color, you would keep the tail really long so that you
Exactly,
could do that.
exactly. So what I do is like I'll do, so see these long tails? Like sometimes I'll actually, I've got my baggie and I'll just like, oh, I want a little bit of blah, blah, blah. So I'll do like a stitch, cause I like it when there's like a little note. See how there's like a little blurb? So that's one
Yeah.
stitch.
Over here.
Like one poking through.
Yeah, so like this right there.
Right.
So those are 2 stitches and then the tail. So I'll put like, oh, I'll do a stitch and then I draw it across.
And do you block these?
So, some of the bigger ones are really, I'm like, oh, that would be really great if it was more square. So I have toyed with blocking them.
Uh-huh.
It gets kind of felted when I block them. The smaller ones you don't necessarily have to, because if I put the
Right.
fabric on them, they're fine.
Like that.
Yeah, exactly. So this one came out and, once you put the fabric on it and I, kind of stretch it the way I want, it's fine. There are a couple that I have tried to block.
What does blocking mean? I don't know that.
So blocking is where, the fabric, what's nice about, any natural fibers is that, if it gets wet and you kind of stretch it, you can, within reason, you can kind of like, when you have a fancy, or when you have a sweater that you wash in, when you wash in water and then you stretch it, you put it the way that you want, you shape it. So there's this kind of wiggle room, since I don't count, which is something that I really, I'm like, oh, there's an escape hatch, because you can just make it a square and dry it. But when they get really big, it's a pain. And so a couple I've done on my studio wall, I've just, sprayed them, and I haven't gotten the iron, but, so that's something that I'm kind of working on. And I've had some success with that. So that's nice, but I need some blocking mats.
This is just history. Who taught you how to crochet?
Me.
Okay, so you,
And some
you
YouTube
did,
videos.
and so you did it from online?
So I had my book, and then I was doing something that was not crochet, and my sister's mother-in-law was like, you're not doing crochet. And so she got me sorted. And so then I was actually doing the stitch.
Uh-huh.
And then I started, once I got the stitch and once I could chain, the chaining I could do, but once I actually got the stitch, then I started doing the videos, and then I started reading the books and seeing the diagrams. But I've moved away from the training videos, and now I just kind of do my own thing, for better or for worse.
So you really wanted to learn how to crochet?
I started out wanting to know I wanted to have a skill.
Uh-huh.
And then I realized that I was never going to be very good at the skill. In terms of the crochet pieces, like the nature of I still am like, oh, maybe it would be cool if I would go back and do that. But it's a lot of work to make, I was like, oh, I'll make some placemats. And anyway, so I kind of back to
The
where.
problem is, after you finish the first one, who wants to make like 3 more just like it? To make
Yeah.
some placements.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, do the dish towel, but it's so much work. So then I still have this fantasy that I'll learn Tunisian crochet, and I'll learn how to do patterns, I'll learn how to do proper color work. But I've kind of stepped back.
Well, you've sort of given yourself some freedom that, like if you knew too much technique, it might really not be to your benefit.
I sense that if I knew more, I would be alarmed at my craftsmanship. And I would be like, oh, that's not right. You know, and so that, I mean, there is an element to that. It's kind of, so in art school, you know, and it's a whole strategy to do something that you don't know how to do, because it always looks great.
It's the child's painting.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, there's a whole strategy. And there, you know, there's just an amazing show of a woman who, her ceramics that she makes, she goes, I take classes and then I leave before they teach me, you know, so that it can, you know, and they're amazing. But she doesn't, you know, she's using marker on the, you know, I mean, it's wild. And so and I kind of feel like a part of me is like, that's a cop-out. I mean, there's a tradition, you know, there's certain things that you should know how to do.
Thank you.
But, yeah, so part of me is like, anyone should be able to do anything. And anyone should choose what they want, and should know the technique and then choose not to follow it. But there is a, you know, I started getting a little tighter when I started knowing more. And
I don't think that's so easy to leave the technique if you know it personally.
No.
You think it's harder to, because if you know the technique.
I perceive what you're sharing right now is
Yeah.
you give yourself a lot more freedom to just invent and create. That's what I hear.
Yeah, and that's what's important to me. So freedom is very important to me, and so that, you know, that's kind of why I'm in this racket, is that in the context, I mean, there's certain rules that you have to follow in the studio. Like you have, you know, there's colors and there's, you know, you can't, you know, it's not magic, but there is a realm of absolute freedom, which is you can do whatever you want. And knowing that, and knowing that you can do whatever you want, and you start it and you end it and you say when it's done, that is incredibly liberating. And that is not something I'm really in a rush to give up.
Isn't that sort of the dialectic between art and craft?
So this is so interesting, because there's like all of these conversations about, and I think increasingly we're understanding that the gray in these areas, because, you know, the artists are like, you know, we're free, and the craftspeople are not free because they know what it's going to look like at the end. But increasingly you're like, well, actually those categories are created to kind of keep, you know, in the Bauhaus, all of the women were not allowed to paint. All the women had, you know, so these what women are doing in craft is not, I think that you can use craft to explore freedom, which looks very much, which I see, having been trained to do art, feels like home to me. So, and I think also, you know, you can use, there are quite a few people who you can make a painting that is very much like a craft, that is very close-ended and is very perfect. And I think that, so I you know, the categories, I think, it's there's definitely a tension, and it's definitely, for me, it's about freedom. It's the kind of defining thing.
Well, sort of whether you think of crochet yarn as another medium, whether it's paint or whatever, it's not the medium that's forcing it into be a craft or a piece of art. It's just the label that people are putting on it. Or,
I mean, increasingly I'm like, oh, I'm gonna make a painting. You know, I'm starting to talk about these like they're paintings. You know, oh, I need some more colors. You know, and so the yarn is the paint. You know, it's just, you know, it's a stand-in. And so what I'm doing is very much, it's the same thing. I'm just using, I'm doing it a different way. I'm mixing my colors. I'm like, oh, I've got to mix my blacks. And so, you know, my husband is kind of like, okay, now they're paintings, got it. You know,
They are very painterly.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, now I understand. So now we're moving the paintings. So, you know, he's a philosopher and he kind of works with me on this. He's like, okay, all right, okay. So yeah, I mean, I don't see them as being discrete, but and that's kind of wonderful. You know, that's kind of, yeah. And I love it when things get messy and when things get mixed up and when things get confused.
I like it when things aren't square.
Oh my God, they're not square. And that's square.
That's pretty square.
That's pretty
But I
square.
keep coming back to this little bit here, and I just love this little bit because it's the not square bit.
So you know, the problem is that like I'm like, oh, I really need some more on the sides, and so then they get a little bit more square, but you can even see they kind of go woo.
Well, these take so much longer to do than painting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes.
Cause I've hooked rugs and I also paint, and rug hooking takes a whole lot longer than painting.
A whole lot longer.
Yeah.
And that has been, I mean, that's one of the things that's been really amazing for me is that you make something and so my hand moves really fast. And
That's
so
good.
yeah, it's great. Woo!
Must be nice.
Yeah, so I'm a fast painter, but you have to sit with this for longer, and you have to make, you know, I make monstrous things, and having to make something that's monstrous, because if you start out and you don't know what you're making, and it's monstrous, then you have to live with it. It's very uncomfortable, but you can't just, like, if it's a drawing, you just or paint over it. So sitting with things and problem solving, the time investment forces me to kind of have to think about things, problem solve. And I'm a total, I like to put myself in very uncomfortable positions when I'm making art, which is very strange and odd and kind of masochistic. But I like to put myself in very difficult situations. I like for it to, you know, I like to like make it really hard and it feels like it'll never work out because it's so crazy. And, you know, so I just like high stakes, which is so weird, but.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of risk, especially in fiber art making, that makes looking at it so electrifying because the maker, you know, you are like committing to this in a way, in like a real visionary way that you don't have a lot of idea of how it's going to look or be or like exist in space at the end.
Mm-hmm.
That's something flat on like a two-dimensional canvas or piece of paper just can't access quite as easily. That kind of like risk of time and risk of labor that might not work out, but doing it anyway. You know, I think that
It's
like
kind
is
of insane.
part of what makes work like this so amazing to see and so exciting to see as a viewer and as an artist.
And I do really working on the big ones because of that level of insanity and the masochism. I'm like, whoa. I mean, they're really.
But it translates to the viewer.
Oh,
you know,
well, that's
it
great.
really
That
does.
is so good.
Yeah, I think on a whole, like it's so amazing to see such an ambitious piece of work made out of cloth and yarn because we know that you don't know, like you have no way of like sketching out a draft on a piece of paper and then filling it in. Like you are starting from one stitch and then building thousands more with a vision that it will work out in the end. And there's something about that that's like another layer of material.
And people respond to that, whether they know it's crochet and how crochet works or not, or whether they're just looking at it as a piece. I mean, they're responding to the mystery of it, of how did it come to be.
Yeah.
And I do like
whether you
that.
understand how it came to be or not.
Yeah.
Do you ever rip out stitches, or do you just kind of commit and say, done this and I'm gonna make it work?
I will, you know, I don't have a hard and fast rule. Like there have been some real monsters that I just don't, you know, sewing, you know, I don't know how do you fix it? How do you erase? So I have ripped out.
Mhm.
I've ripped out, like, I think the most I've ripped out was like 45 minutes worth of work. You know, it's like, this is not, it's too, you know, let's, you know, if it's more, you know, if it's like hours of work.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten that far into a situation where I'm just like, ugh. But it definitely, having to kind of live with stuff is painful and uncomfortable, but it's made me a better person, I think.
Have you ever felted one of these? I'm just thinking of like throwing one in the washing machine.
No,
and
so
just seeing what
yes,
happens.
I did. So there were a couple. Do you guys know what felting is? The felting,
Yeah.
so where you just like, and it happens a lot of times at my house when sweaters get thrown. Yes, I felted some because I was making. They were going to be pillows. Like I was going to do a bunch of pillows. All of these, like I have so many. And it's beautiful, but I haven't seen how the bright colors. I did one that was kind of not as that was more neutral, and it kind of disappeared. Like it kind of became, you know, a little fuzzy shadow of itself, which was nice. It was very, you know, it was very palatable, but it didn't have. I haven't tried to felt one of these really bright ones. But there's a big piece, a huge piece that I did that's like 96 by 90. It's a huge thing that I was going to felt because the colors are the colors of, you guys know Hudson Bay blankets? Of course, everyone knows Hudson Bay blankets.
No, I have
Where,
one.
oh, do you know Hudson Bay blankets? Yeah. Okay. I didn't necessarily know those because I was growing up in St. Louis, and so, but like, everybody, Canada, everybody knows them. So I did a piece that was supposed to be like a Hudson Bay blanket, and it was but it kind of became like a Bayeux tapestry. Like it's just kind of these shapes. I should have brought a picture of it, but and so I'm thinking about felting that, but it's huge, and so I have to find a washing machine that's going to be big enough to take it. So I think there's an industrial washing machine.
But you know what, I wonder if that wouldn't, because, you know, obviously whenever you get a sweater, a bright sweater, you know, separate your colors, because inevitably your darks are going to diminish the brightness of the bright ones, if you felt stuff.
Yes, and that's, you know, the margin for it kind of just becoming less.
Yeah.
Especially since I'm using less expensive yarn, and I'm using really bright reds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the next piece of my practice is really to kind of understand the fibers piece of it, because the quality of the felting and the quality of felt is so amazing. So if there's a way that I can get to the intensity of the colors I need with the texture of the felt, I'm all for that. And also the felt, you know, I like, you know, I like these kind of really, I think I gravitated towards, you know, there's a lot of different crochet stitches. Like everyone kind of knows kind of looser, grainy knot crochet stitches. I kind of gravitated towards crochet that is tighter because I really like knotted rugs. You know, I like that kind of, I like it, all of these stitches together. And so I like that kind of tightness. So the felting appeals.
So the Hudson Bay,
Oh yeah.
the Hudson Bay blanket I have, it has some history. My grandmother gave it to my mom and dad for a wedding present, and I actually did wash it in my washing machine. And it, you know, it's a really big blanket, but I don't have I just have a normal washing machine, and it worked.
And it worked? Okay.
Yeah, and I have it's when I wash my wool sweaters, it's something I bought at a knit shop where you put it in the water, but you don't rinse it out.
Oh, so it's like
It's like a lanolin wash or something.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I don't remember the name, but that's what I used on it,
Did you use cold water?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I have other things I've done, and then I think I just hung it out on my clothesline. You're reminding me I should get it out. I mean, thank you, I just.
So
and-
we have a Hudson Bay blanket that we got from my aunt from Canada. So my aunt is in Montreal, and so she gave us a Hudson Bay blanket, and so that's been our kind of, our marital, that's our like these things that are passed down.
Right,
And when I was at her house, there was a blanket that I saw. I was at her house for Canadian Thanksgiving, which is a month before regular Thanksgiving. And I saw a crocheted blanket that all of the children of the family, my cousins, called the sick blanket, because when they were sick, this is the blanket that they would get, everyone would get to have this blanket. It was the magic blanket that would make you better.
right.
Which is just like the most, and as a kid, you could totally imagine like, oh, I get the good blanket. And so I was like, oh, I'm gonna make that stitch. And I started making part of it, and then I couldn't do the same thing for a whole blanket. And so then I started kind of doing my own riff. And then it turned, then 2020 happened, and then it turned into the Bayeux tapestry and kind of a rumination on our times. But it was made as a blanket. And so I have to kind of see how it has to be washed because it's filthy. It's been, schlepped around for 2 years while I was working on it. And, but yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, I photographed it before, and so then,
Yeah, I just did like delicate cold, and you basically don't rinse out the lanolin part, and it's fine.
I have a fantasy of going to the, there's so much knowledge about fibers and about, how you care for these things. Like I have a fantasy of just, having a workshop or, learning from people who do this, who wash things and repair things, and that kind of interests me in terms of how you actually, care for these things. Because these things have lived in the world, and, but I think they need some love. And that's the piece that I need to learn.
Well, the blankets, the blanket's like 80 years, it's been in my family 80 years. My parents aren't alive anymore, but.
Yeah, we've got one from,
Yeah,
my
and
husband's
it's.
family's French Canadian, we've got one that came from at least his grandparents,
Yeah, and
if not before.
I mean, you think about it, isn't it beautiful that things last?
Yeah.
And then, there is a certain, like, who do you leave it to, but, so, I'm sure yours will last quite a long time.
Oh my gosh. So there's a different threshold for, for durable wear. And so that would be amazing if they were good enough to actually, so to kind of, that level of making for actual use
Yeah.
is something that is so amazing. And so that's where the craft knowledge becomes key. And so in terms of like, if you have that craft knowledge, there's certain rules, but there are some things that you need to know if you, the understanding of what is expected of an art object is very different from what is expected of an object that is in the world. And so, that's something that I kind of am interested in navigating. Like, how do you make something that can actually live in the world and stay and be passed down is, that is something that I'm also, that's the knowledge that I would like. There's objects that are also art objects that can also live in the world, and how do you kind of navigate that terrain?
I also feel like your medium being, especially you're using wool yarn.
Yeah.
It brings, your work to another level, because you're working with something, you know, like silk, or you're working with a natural fiber that actually had was from a living, breathing body. And, you know, so that too carries with it, whereas, you know, paints are pigments that may or may not be from, you know, organic, you know, so this is, it has a life beyond, you know, in addition, I should say, you know, expands beyond the
It's
yarn.
already connected to the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Started out
It's
connected to the world.
repurposing or something.
I mean, I like that. I mean, I like that idea of things that are, you know, that are connected. And there's a whole thing, you know, in terms of pigments, there's a whole movement of fresco that at Skowhegan Art School, where they're actually teaching students to make fresco, but they're using the pigments, you know, the earth and the rocks they're just rocks that are ground. You know, when you talk about the earth and putting just rocks into stone, and the pigment becomes the thing. So this kind of idea of like color and the earth and, you know, sheep, and that also, I mean, this could decay, which I really like that idea, that there's nothing, you know, there's no artificial, I mean, the wool, I like the idea that it could actually decompose over time. Like, it's not like I'm making enormous quantities of things for the landfill.
And it's also not like
Yeah.
plastic where it's gonna be
Yeah.
natural.
Yeah, I mean, that would be, yeah, exactly. So that's why I have to get better at taking care of my fibers. But there's definitely a perishability in terms of returning back to the earth that I like. I like that idea, even though I'm trying to keep them for as long as I can.
So just to offer a time check, we've about 10 minutes before noon. If there are other questions you want to make sure you get in before we wrap, or if we wanted to do some closer looking over here.
Do people want to do, so I put some pieces up, and then we've got pieces on the table, so,
I mean, even if we just want to look at them closely and then be able to ask questions about those.
yeah,
Can you take pictures?
I do not mind if you take pictures.
Just
Please
look, the
take
closer
pictures.
you look, the more you look, the more you see. Really.
Yeah.
With these things.
Definitely, so everyone should feel free to come up and kind of look at them and keep asking questions. The questions are.
And feel
it's
free,
so-
I mean, Liz said to feel free to go up here
Yeah,
and
go
get
up
closer.
here, yeah, definitely, and then, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna close our recording, so maybe say hi to whoever ends up watching online.
Thank you so much, this has been so lovely.
Yeah.